Are the Dallas Cowboys in the market for another speed receiver? All that and more this episode of Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your
Locked
daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked
on.
Locked
on.
Cowboys.
Locked on Cowboys.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. Check him out on Twitter at McCoolBCB. Landon, we are starting to hear some rumblings of private workouts, some 30 visits. We still have pro days going on. How you doing today, buddy?
I'm doing okay. You know, I had a kind of a rough morning because I read the news about the Cowboys visiting with Tank Dell, and then I spit taked a bunch of coffee all over my computer. So,
problem if you're an IT guy.
I'm cleaning. Yeah, that's right. I'm cleaning it up. I'm drying it out, and now I'm gonna have to figure out a way to talk about to comment about this because it's kind of mind blowing, honestly.
Yeah. So you mentioned the news. The Cowboys, I believe they met with Nathaniel Tank Dell from Houston earlier this week. They had a little bit of a private workout. They've also met with a few other smaller receivers in this class. And frankly, if you've met with any receiver, it's a small receiver class. So you probably met with some of them. But
true.
Let's talk about Dell specifically, because it feels like this is very much a changing of the tide in how the Cowboys view receivers, because we know in the past they like the guys that are 6 foot, 199 pounds or more. To draft a 5'8", 166-pound receiver would be quite different for them.
Yeah, we've had some very prominent members of Cowboys Twitter, lobbying for small running backs. This goes beyond that. Like, this guy is a small wide receiver in the sense that he's under 170 pounds, under 5'9". And the truth of the matter is, I mean, to be honest, I think you and I have both had discussions about this. We've watched Tank Dell. We watched a ton of him when he was at the Senior Bowl. We watched all his one-on-ones. I've seen tape of him just because he's interested me. But all of that was kind of, how do I say this? Done in my own time, just because I'm interested in the player, not in pursuit of my kind of gig covering this team, because our team doesn't draft guys like this. Like, they just basically filter these guys out. That's clearly changing, and I think the change started, early last year or some point last year. And I don't really know whether this was a conscious decision made previous to last year that they want to start looking more at these players. But, obviously, Turpin became a player that they got on the team. And when they hired Turpin, it was like, when they signed Turpin, it was like, well, he's a kick returner. Maybe they're carving out an exception here. Then as the season went on, they were looking more and more for receivers to kind of be that number two, as we all know. And then obviously they brought in Hilton, and Hilton obviously doesn't follow any of that kind of predetermined template stuff that we had used previously for the Cowboys wide receivers. And it just seems like now we're seeing a steady drumbeat away from that, right? You mentioned that Josh Downs was a guy that they've included Tank Dell. And it's pretty clear that this is not like just a one-off situation. They are clearly moving away from that kind of minimum threshold from wide receivers. And I, for one, am thankful for it, because the game is changing. These sort of players have value, a lot of value. And you can get really explosive, dynamic players that, may not fit the kind of traditional templates that, old school kind of scouting departments like in their wide receivers.
Yeah. Since 1985, the Cowboys have drafted one receiver under 5'9". Do you know who it is?
Is it Ryan Switzer?
It's Ryan Switzer. That's it.
Yeah.
And even Ryan Switzer was 185 pounds, which, I mean, that's 20 pounds heavier than Tank Dell. So we're talking about a big step down from even Ryan Switzer. This is just a team that has historically not valued these smaller receivers. But I do wonder if they've just seen the way the game is changing, and they see this draft class, and it's like, you know what? If Tank Dell is available in the 3rd or 4th round, and he's a playmaker, and we can make him, a number 4, number 5 receiver, why not?
I mean, we have to like kind of just contextualize how big a change this is, because the Cowboys previous to this like wouldn't even consider average sized wide receivers. You know, like I mean 5'10", 5'11", they, their threshold I'm pretty sure started at 6 feet mostly.
Yeah.
I think they made exceptions, but for the most part, that was kind of their template.
If you were going to be shorter than 6 foot, you better be able to play special teams like a Dwayne Harris, right?
Yeah,
you better be able to return kicks and do that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and now they're looking at a guy who is not just like small by receiver, but like historically small by by receiver measurements. So it's a big change. It's it opens up the field quite a bit for the Cowboys scouting department, and honestly, this late in the game for us, it makes me feel like, oh, great. Now I've got about 10 more guys that I have to go watch because I just assumed that the Cowboys would be out on them previous, and maybe they're not. So I think it's good news for Cowboys fans because, again, it just opens up the opportunity for them to draft more of these kind of dynamic players. And frankly, for a team that, we've had complaints has been too slow, for probably the last 2 or 3 years, this is a way to inject more speed onto your team as some of these smaller, more dynamic players.
And I think that's it, right? I think they've realized they're just not fast enough. Like their number 1 receiver, CeeDee Lamb, is a 4.5-ish guy, right? Yeah. Michael Gallup, even when he was healthy, was probably a 4.5 guy. Your tight ends are both 4.8 tight ends. Like there's just a lack of speed now outside of Brandon Cooks. But we should also mention, like the Cowboys trading for Brandon Cooks is something new to them. They would never have gone out and acquired a guy, first of all, with that salary and somebody of that size. So it's also clear that they're just changing the template of what they need at receiver, or they're just bending some of their, maybe restrictions when it comes to draft and trades.
Well, and look, I mean, not to kind of segue into something else, but to loop in kind of further conversations, it seems to me that the real change that's going to happen in this offense, just based on reading tea leaves of a couple of different things, is that the Cowboys are going to be more interested in putting more receivers out en route. And what that means is that means less protection for Dak, closer in, but more options for who to throw it to once they're out en route. Now, the kind of balance that you have to find when you're marrying route concepts with protection schemes is that you can't have like a 5-man protection, meaning like just the 5 offensive linemen, no help from tight ends, no running backs. You can't really have a 5-man protection scheme and then run only deep routes, right? Because that takes time to develop, and it takes time for you got to buy your quarterback time in order for those routes to develop. And that's kind of what a Coryell system, lives on, right? Good protection, sometimes max protection, putting a couple guys down the field and trying to win one-on-ones. What we may start to see more of now is, because you've got less protection, because the ball is probably going to come out a little bit quicker, you need guys who win right away with route running
and after the catch.
Yeah, and then you can do something with the ball after they've caught it, right? So less about about beating a corner down the field with route running, about jumping over and grabbing the ball over smaller corners, more about quickly getting the ball out to the receivers and then having them make plays. And this is the kind of player you need to kind of facilitate that. You put a guy like this in the slot, have him run a whip route, have him run a slant, have him, shake off defenders and give easy, quick completions before Dak gets absolutely murdered because there's only 5 men protecting him from the fearsome defensive lineman that he's facing.
And maybe we'll see a de-emphasis in tight end, right? The last several years, the tight end has been
reshaping, right? A reshaping potentially of what they're asking those guys to do, right? Well, less importance with pass blocking,
right? We've seen Schultz be the second leading target player on the offense, I think, each of the last 3 years, or up there. I think in 2021 he was 3rd behind Amari and CD. Maybe you'll just see the tight end targets go down, and that just opens up the pie a little bit more to some more receivers. And that way you can get, 3-4 receivers on the field and use them in some different ways. I want to talk, Landon, about Tank Dell specifically and how he might fit into the offense next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The tournament is heating up, and there's no better place to get on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, FanDuel is giving new customers a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That is up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and sign up today to claim your no-sweat first bet. Then you can wager on anything and everything from money line to point spreads to which team will be cutting down the net at the end of the tournament, all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. So don't miss your shot at a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. Make every moment more with FanDuel. All right, Landon, let's talk about Tank Dell specifically, because I know we've got to see him a lot.
Yeah.
What do you think about his game, and how do you think he would fit into this Cowboys offense?
Well, he was practically uncoverable at Senior Bowl practices. And look, let's be clear, like those are definitely geared towards that type of receiver. Guys who, especially the one-on-ones, it's like it's untimed down where the defense has no help and it's man coverage and but
we've seen receivers like that do really well at the
yes.
Senior. I think of like Calvin Austin last year from Memphis, who had a very similar type of week.
Yeah, I will say that I felt like Dell was still doing it at a much more impressive rate than
I agree.
Yeah, than Austin and some of the other previous guys we saw. I mean, I'm pretty sure he won every rep I saw. Did he?
I just retweeted a video on my Twitter account. You go check it out, of every single rep that he did at the Cedar Bowl. He won every one.
Yeah, I thought so. Okay. So that's just. I mean, that's a standard that we shouldn't hold incredibly high, but he still did it, and it's still impressive, and it shows you the kind of explosion that we have now. Obviously, that's not going to be the case in the NFL. I don't think that he. I think teams obviously will have a hard time covering a player like this. The question becomes like, is someone like this, physically able to hold up for 17 games worth of punishment? How much of a feature role do you want to have for a guy like this? As far as like where he would fit in the offense, I think, for the most part, I would assume he would be a slot player. I think he has some potential to be a Z, because I think, you can move him off the line, obviously, and kind of do some things if you wanted. You did see a little bit of him operating on the outside. I think that it would be tough to kind of consider him a full-time outside receiver.
It's just not going to happen. Right?
Yeah, I just don't think that's going to happen. I think his best bet and his best situation would be, kind of like a tool similar to, what you would have hoped to use someone like Turpin for. Maybe the kind of offensive weapon routes or deployments that you would have love to use Turpin for. That's what you would use for Dell. Quick screens, tunnel screens, have him come out of the backfield, hand him the football, reverses, jet sweeps, all of that stuff. Plays that will get him the opportunity to have the ball with blockers. Play get him the ball quickly so he can make people miss. Those are the kind of things, obviously, that you're going to want to do with Dell. I think he has more skill outside of that than a lot of these other kind of diminutive wide receivers we've seen. And yes. I do think he has that ability to, go down the field a little bit and go up and catch the ball. We saw him elevate and catch the ball a couple times in a way that you don't necessarily see smaller wide receivers do. But I would say that I would still probably, kind of box him, at least at first, into that sort of gadget role.
I would say this is going to sound blasphemous, but I think he is a better pure receiver than Tavon Austin, who happens to be one of my favorite college players of all time. But I think the role is probably similar, right?
Yes.
Like out of the slot, every once in a while you can have him on the outside if you just want him to run deep. But the goal is to get him the ball close to the line of scrimmage and let him make plays after the catch. I will say, over the last couple of years, Landon, we've seen teams use this type of player. The Cardinals had Greg Dortch last year, who caught like 50 passes. We've seen the Bills use Isaiah McKenzie in this role. We've seen, the Rams spent a second round pick on Tutu Atwell, and they used Brandon Powell in that role. So I think the NFL is becoming more open to using these guys as part-time players out of the slot. So I could see how, as a down the roster receiver, he would make sense.
And another guy, we've been kind of mentioning diminutive receivers, and another guy that I'm, shocked we haven't brought his name up yet, but just to kind of compare the roles, right, is Cole Beasley, right?
Yep.
Cole Beasley was a guy who was obviously a slot specialist, but specifically was such a good route runner that he was kind of a possession receiver, specifically on like third downs where you just needed a few yards and you knew he was going to create that kind of separation. I think Dell can be that type of receiver, except I also think he's there, right? So I imagine, I don't know that he's going to be like immediately the kind of chain mover that you saw with Cole Beasley. And I think that was kind of extraordinary what Cole Beasley kind of came into the league, was able to do, right?
Well, it took him a while too to even get
there.
Yeah,
it wasn't quite right away. And I think that's the other thing to keep in mind here is that I think Dell will be able to stick around a little bit because he's going to be able to do more for teams than a Cole Beasley would have. But I think the goal is to try to get him to a spot where he can do the kind of extra stuff, the play, the game planning stuff that you specifically are trying to, leverage his skills for, where you're getting the ball, but also, with the idea that he is working towards that role as the kind of quick separator in the slot that can be a reliable target on third downs. That's I think ultimately the valuable aspect of his game that he's going to have to develop in order to kind of be a regular on any sort of offense.
All right, say the Cowboys draft Tank Dell. What feels like the right spot in the draft? Is it the third round? Is it the fourth round?
It's crazy because I haven't really been paying attention, honestly, because he's like, just not a guy that I thought of. I'm thinking like, from what I've seen, I'm always shocked. He always ends up being the guy that I'm shocked is still available, when I get to the fourth round sometimes, I would say, injecting some realism into this, and especially now that we're starting to see that even teams like Dallas are looking into these small wide receivers, I imagine that the market for these guys is a little bit higher than we're expecting. So I would say he's probably a late 2 or early 3, mid 3 type guy. I think just based on what rumblings you're seeing, and I'm never usually the stock value guy as far as like kind of having a full picture on what everyone feels like. But I do think that just based on what I've seen in my own mock drafts, based on what I've seen other people talking about, they value the guy. That Senior Bowl definitely turned heads. But I feel to this day there's going to be some teams that are going to give him a little bit of a stock hit simply based on his size.
To me, it feels like he goes where between picks like 75 and 125, right? Like late third, early fourth round. In Dallas, obviously, they have a pick late in the third round. So maybe if they address the 2 needs that they need in the first 2 picks and they just say, hey, this is a guy that we really like. Kevontae Turpin's not a lock to make this roster. We need some more speed on the offense. Let's get somebody like Tank Dell. I could certainly see it. I want to ask you, Landon, about some of the other smaller receivers in this class that we've seen connected to the Cowboys next. All right, Landon, we've heard some rumblings about some other guys that the Cowboys might like, including a guy that we brought up earlier, Josh Downs. We heard about Marvin Mims from Oklahoma, another receiver in this class that comes in at 5'11". We heard some rumors maybe about Jaden Reed, a 5'10" receiver from Michigan State. My question for you is, if the Cowboys draft a receiver in this class, do you think it'll be one of the smaller guys, or do you think they're more likely to, on late day 2, early day 3, gamble on a guy like Michael Wilson from Stanford or A.T. Perry from Wake Forest? What do you see happening here?
I think that's the real question here is this a switch in preference, or is this just an opening up of the filtering, right? So I would guess as it stands right now, that what they'll start doing is just removing the filter and then adding these guys into their larger wide receiver pool with the grades affected by their height and weight in an appropriate manner. Right. So I I don't think I think they're going to grade these guys based how they are as wide receivers. That grade will include size measurements and metrics that will have the normal kind of effect on their overall grade. And then when it's time to draft, the guy with the highest grade will get chosen. I think the difference, this is different than trying to go and draft your wide receiver one, right?
Yes.
I think you're trying to find guys who can complement what your wide receiver one can do. And I think that a variety of body types can fill that role. So I don't know that I think that because they got Brandon Cooks, they have met the minimum threshold for adding speed to the team.
Sure.
So I don't know that they need to feel, I don't know if they need to feel like they have to go out and get more speed, but I also don't think that they will turn down more speed simply because the wide receiver is under 5'11".
The other thing that I've been wondering about this offseason is it just feels like the defense is way deeper than the offense. And I wonder if that means that we're going to see more down the roster guys on defense playing special teams and maybe not so many offensive guys playing special teams. I mean, we've known in the past, like wide receivers 4, 5, and 6 basically all have to be able to contribute on special teams. Maybe the philosophy is, hey, wide receiver 4 for us now is going to be somebody who's going to be a big contributor on offense. We don't want to expose that guy to special teams. So let's let Calvin Joseph and Nashawn Wright and CJ Goodwin handle a lot of special team stuff. And we'll just get the best available offensive guys and put them on the field, because I think that would potentially open up roster spots for somebody like a Tank Dell, where maybe in previous years we wouldn't have had that.
I think that there's a potential symbiotic helpfulness that could happen if the Cowboys decided to do exactly what you're talking about, right? Like maybe rostering more defensive players on game day in order to facilitate, not only to facilitate the rotation that you want to do and that the defensive coordinator obviously wants to do throughout the game, but also to help facilitate more special teams load on those defensive players. First of all, obviously defensive players are probably better generally at special teams, specifically because they're used to tackling. That's just a job that they're used to doing. Now you don't have to roster a Noah Brown in order to keep your special teams running smoothly, because you're not necessarily reliant on that receiver. That probably means you roster less receivers on game day, or maybe I shouldn't say that, because maybe you make that up in tight ends, right? Or some other kind of reconfiguration. But I would say maybe what they do is they roster fewer offensive players, knowing that they don't need to have them contribute to special teams. That helps the offense, because actually you still get more offensive useful players, if that makes sense. Players that you actually want to use on offense, as opposed to having to facilitate special teams. And the defense gets the depth they want while still being able to overall facilitate the numbers that you need for it.
Because we've seen in previous years, they'll roster 6 receivers with
exactly.
only the top 3 being exclusively on offense. Now maybe you only roster 5, but all 5 are
important. All 5 are deadly on as offensive weapons, right? As opposed to having your rostering 6 wide receivers and then having your bottom 3 be guys who can run a route and can catch the ball, but they are mostly on their game day roster because they're special teams aces.
Which isn't all that different than what Green Bay had, like, let's say back in 2010, when it was Greg Jennings and James Jones and Jordy Nelson, Donald Driver, and they had a bunch of these other receivers. Like, their top 4 receivers played a ton of the snaps. Maybe that's just what you see from Dallas this year. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens at the wide receiver position for the Cowboys. I kind of assumed once they traded for Brandon Cooks that they were out of the wide receiver market. That might not be the case at all. It sounds like the Cowboys are very interested to sell that.
Again, this is a whole other topic for a whole other show. But the throwaway line that Mike McCarthy gave Dave Moore the other day about wanting to change the protections, to me, that opens up a lot of different conversations, including the fact that, like we just said, more wide receivers en route. Maybe that means less tight ends. So there could be the chance that we're seeing a roster that is going to include more wide receivers rostered on game days because that's the kind of deployment that they're going to be doing more often than adding a bunch of tight ends.
I would not be surprised. Again, I'm going to reference another Packers team, 2011.
Yeah.
These guys all had at least 400 receiving yards. Jordy Nelson, Greg Jennings, James Jones, Donald Driver, Randall Cobb. Maybe we see something more like that where you legitimately feel good about 4 or 5 receivers and you're just trying to find ways to get your best personnel on the field.
And this kind of scenario where you're using more 5-man protection schemes, you're not necessarily reliant on the tight end to be as much of a blocker. Maybe you don't need to draft another tight end high. Maybe you can cobble together with the tight end position, an H-back position with the guys that you have.
Fullback.
And then in the 7th round, what you do is you go get a fullback for this team.
Yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting to see what happens with the Cowboys in the fullback market.
Fullback's coming, guys.
It probably is an undrafted free agent. Let's not get our hopes up too much. But
I don't care. Fullback's coming.
That is it for today's show. Thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every day. Now make your second listen the Locked On NFL Scouting Show with the Draft Dudes. From free agency to the draft, salary cap management, and more. Join NFL experts Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino as they take you through what it's like to build a successful NFL franchise every Monday through Friday. Find Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We want to thank you for checking out our show. Please go to YouTube. We post shows every single day over there. Go follow Landon on Twitter at McCoolBCB. I'm at Marcus_Mosher. We'll see you guys next time.